Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 11 of Strategic Planning and Leadership. We are continuing our exploration of Jim Collins and his discussion around leadership and moving organizations from good to great. So, this week we have his monograph, Good to Great in the Social Sector. So, that's a sort of a complement to his book, Good to Great, and a complement to the reading that we did last week. I also included in Moodle, I included a link to a TED Talk by Seth Godin. Uh, it's around leadership. I think it's really relevant to the sort of leadership that Collins is talking about. And so take a look at that. We will also have another discussion forum this week. So that's weeks 10 and 11 material. So that is all about the good to great material. So look forward to seeing what you have to say about that and some of your impressions of what we've been reading. So, what I wanted to talk about a little bit this week is, as we explore this concepts that Collins put forth that distinguish great organizations. His take on this is that it doesn't really matter whether it's a business organization or a government, a nonprofit organization. Really, what we're looking at, as he says, is this language of greatness. That being said, there are some things that are different in the public sector, and we know this. So, the reading this week, I think, is a nice way to address some of those differences and talk about some of the concepts and how they apply in the world that we are working in and the world that we are going to be leaders in. So, before we get to that, I wanted to just mention Collins. It's not, I don't think it's in this week's reading, but he does talk about his criteria for greatness with organizations. So it's these three things that he looks at: superior results, distinctive impact, lasting endurance. So as you look at those, obviously you can see that they don't have anything in particular to do with a public or private, business or nonprofit, government. Those things can apply to any of those sorts of organizations. So, sort of the difference is how you measure these things. So he talks about with the superior results, obviously in the business sector, you're going to be looking at your results primarily as profit, how you do financially. In the social sectors, instead, the measurement is going to be around how well you do on delivering on your mission. He has an interesting take on distinctive impact. He talks about truly great enterprises make such a unique contribution to the communities they touch. It does its work with such unadulterated excellence that if it were to disappear, it would leave a gaping hole that could not easily be filled by any other institution on the planet. So that sort of gets into that being the best at what you do as part of that, the hedgehog concept that we'll talk about a little bit more. And then finally, lasting endurance. Truly great organizations obviously have a positive impact over a long period of time. When they have setbacks, they are resilient, they bounce back even stronger than before. And I think most importantly, great organizations sort of transcend that single, really extraordinary leader. And so it's the organization that is great, not necessarily just one charismatic leader within that organization. So I thought it'd be worth just talking a little bit about how we're going to think about what makes an organization great. And then in this week's readings, or the social, good to great in the social sectors, what Collins does is he takes 5 of his concepts that we read about last week, and he talks about the issues that are a little bit different in government and nonprofit work. So one of those is about defining great and about how it is we go about measuring success when profit isn't the what we keep score by. Another issue he talks about is that level 5 leadership, getting things done in the social sectors in government and nonprofit requires leadership that's a little bit different. He talks here about diffuse power, and so we'll delve into that a little bit in this reading. The first who was, obviously if it's first, it's the most important thing he talks about is getting the right people on the bus, getting the right people in the right seats. Obviously, that's more difficult to do when you're in government, in particular, when there's more constraints around hiring and firing and moving people into positions. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. The hedgehog concept, that includes basically those three intersecting rings. What are you passionate about? What's your mission? What's your purpose of your organization? What can you be best at? And then in the business sector, that third circle is around what's your economic engine? What is it that drives your profits? So obviously that's a little bit of a problem in the social sectors. What he talks about is that there still is an economic engine, but what he refers to it as is a resource engine. You still need the resources in order to be a great organization. So we'll talk about that just a little bit. And then finally, turning the flywheel, and that's about building momentum over a long period of time. And he talks about doing that through brand. And so one of the interesting things that happens, I think, and he alludes to this, especially in the social sectors and in nonprofit sectors, sometimes when an organization is doing really well, that actually makes it more difficult to sustain funding because some of your funders may look at you and say, you're doing well, you don't need this grant, you don't need this government funding. And so, how do you deal with that as a leader of one of these organizations? And he talks about doing that through brand. So these are the 5 things that you'll read about in this week's reading. And I wanted to just touch a little bit on each of those here. And then we will talk about a lot of these also in our discussion forum this week. So defining great, calibrating success without having that profit motive, the money to measure by. And so one of the things he talks about in this week's reading is that in the business sector, money is both an input and an output. It's something that you have as a resource to you, but is also something that you measure by. In the social sectors, it is only an input. It is not something that you measure your success by. And so social organizations, the performance has to be assessed relative to its mission. How do we effectively do that? So he talks about it's a little bit harder, obviously, if you don't have quantitative data to measure your success by. But he says you have to assess whether you're doing your work well, whether you're meeting your mission. You have to track your progress. So one of the things that I thought was interesting from this week's reading is he says, if the evidence is primarily qualitative, if you're just you're looking at qualitative data, think like a trial lawyer, assembling the combined body of evidence. If you do have qualitative data, he says, think of yourself as a laboratory scientist, assembling and assessing that data. So we'll have some discussion about, again, how do we assess whether we are being successful in our organizations. The level 5 leadership issue, he talks about, organizations in the social sectors typically rely on more what he calls legislative leadership as opposed to executive leadership. So in executive leadership, which you typically have more in business organizations, an individual leader does have some concentrated power. They can simply make decisions and enforce those. In legislative leadership, no individual leader, not even the top executive, necessarily has enough power to make some of the most important decisions all by themselves. I see this in particular here at the University of Montana, where the president you would think would be the most powerful person, but in reality, he very much has to depend on relationships with deans, relationships with faculty governance, faculty unions, even student governance. There are a lot of shared stakeholders and shared decision makers in a lot of social sector organizations. And so that's a different skill set. And so one of the things that Collins talks about is, all leaders have to have some skill of both executive and legislative leadership. But in the social sector side, in government and nonprofit organizations, you very likely will need more of those legislative types of leadership skills. I think this ties in pretty well with some of the previous discussion we've had in this class about, in particular, the co-creation concept. How do you engage stakeholders, both internal and external to your organization, in decision-making processes? I mentioned the Seth Godin TED Talk that's out there available for you to watch. One of the things that I like about it is that, like I said, it ties in, I think, pretty well with the conversation and what Jim Collins is talking about. Godin in particular, I think, has been a real sort of leading thinker about marketing and communication within organizations. And again, he's coming to it from more of the business side of it. But he talks about, a lot of power in the past has been through, with organizations, business organizations, has been through sort of that manufacturing, the factory, and being able to produce more and produce faster, have cheaper inputs and better technology to gain an advantage. And then sort of secondarily, a lot of success and power within the business sector comes from sort of the mass marketing and advertising side of it, being able to simply buy people's attention and buy attention to your product or your service through advertising, commercials, whatnot. That has really changed, especially in the last 20 years, as the internet has exploded. That's very much more diffuse. I think if we related this to the public sector, I think we've relied heavily on hierarchy and bureaucracy for that power. And I think, again, both internally and externally, as we've talked about in previous weeks, that same level of sort of control and power within an organization is not there when all of the stakeholders have the ability to communicate with each other external to our sort of internal power structures, the hierarchy of our organization. So I encourage you to watch the video, explore a little bit more from Seth's reading. The third issue that Collins talks about in this week's reading is the first who principle, getting the right people on the bus. One of the things he talks about is that I think we assume that it's harder to attract people to government and to nonprofit organizations simply because we don't pay as well typically as the private sector. But when he talks about one of the things that the social sectors have a compelling advantage around is that people are desperately craving for meaning in their lives, as he says. And he talks about the number one resource in social sectors organizations is having enough of the right people that are committed to the mission. And so that really is a huge resource that we rely on is that commitment from human beings more so than sort of monetary capital. So one of the things he talks about in this week's readings is that in the social sectors we don't have the same level of incentives in terms of financial compensation, and in fact in a lot of cases with nonprofits we are relying on volunteers who are not paying at all, and so he actually says that this first who is even more important in the social sectors because of that. And he talks about applying applying rigor to who you bring on board, even more so in the social sectors, because sort of that selectivity makes the positions that aren't paid as well or volunteer positions seem more attractive, and you will actually attract better people because of that. I think one of the things that's obviously there are constraints, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of our ability in government organizations, in particular, in our hiring processes, and more so even in sort of moving people out of the organization. So this first two it takes a little bit of patience, it takes time, but if you're committed to making sure you have the right people within your organizations, there are some ways that you can accomplish that, and he goes into that a little bit in this week's reading. So the fourth topic is, or the fourth issue that he addresses is the hedgehog concept, and in particular, how we address sort of that core of what the organization is about, and replacing that economic engine with a resource engine. So this is what it looks like sort of in the social sector side of it. So that bottom right-hand circle is really about your resources as inputs, not as both inputs and outputs. So it's the critical question that he talks about is that it's not about how much money does the organization make, but how can we develop a sustainable resource engine to deliver superior performance relative to our mission. So that requires you to understand what drives your resource engine. And in the social sectors, he talks about that being typically three things. Time, people giving time to your organization. It does include money. It includes, obviously, the resources, the monetary resources it takes to fund your organization. And then it takes brand. And so that sort of gets into this final issue of turning the flywheel, of building momentum. And he talks about doing that through the building of brand. Brand reputation, he says, is built on tangible results and emotional share of the heart. And so it's important, he talks about, for your potential supporters not only to believe in your mission, have this sort of share the passion that your organization has, but also believe in your capacity to deliver on that mission. And so that takes consistency of effort over time. It takes consistency of being disciplined to that hedgehog concept of sticking to what you do really well and what's important to be doing. Sticking to your core values and your core purpose, and doing that again over a long period of time. So the other thing that I think is really important in this week's reading is he talks about if you're not at the top level of an organization in a leadership role, but you still have some opportunities within whatever level you're at to build some pockets of greatness, to lead by example, and to use some of these concepts. So again, this we have some advantages actually in the social sectors in terms of people typically are committed to and passionate about causes. So how can we take advantage of that in building great organizations? So again, I hope you enjoy the readings this week. I hope you enjoy the video TED Talk from Seth Godin, and we'll see you in the discussion forums. Thanks, everyone.